A locked door, a silent scream lost to the night, and a secret that refuses to stay buried. This is a tale of shadows and whispered betrayals. Behind the walls of an ancient estate, lives unravel and truths twist in the cold grip of vengeance. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The mystery begins now. It was during one of those grey December afternoons in 1894, when London seemed wrapped in a muffler of fog and silence, that I found Holmes in a most peculiar mood. He lounged upon the settee like a cat in hibernation, eyes half-lidded, fingers steepled, utterly indifferent to the day's times spread before him. I had remarked, half-heartedly, on a jewel robbery in Hammersmith and a political scandal in the Commons, but he had only murmured something unintelligible. The fire crackled, the coals hissed faintly, and I began to wonder if my friend had finally grown weary of crime itself. Then came the knock, firm, precise, and measured with an anxious energy that no ordinary tradesman would possess. Holmes' eyes opened fully at once. He did not rise, but I saw the pulse in his temple quicken. 3 times, evenly spaced, the third, more hesitant than the first, he murmured. A man undecided whether to flee or speak. He turned toward the door, his languor discarded like an old coat. Pray admit him, Watson. I suspect we are about to be visited by someone with a pressing matter and a shadow on his conscience. The man who entered was in his early 30s, pale and stiffly composed, with a manner that suggested breeding struggling against dread. He paused only to glance behind him before stepping fully into our sitting room. Without a word, he reached behind and turned the key in the door. The soft click echoed unnaturally loud. I stiffened instinctively. Holmes, however, seemed amused. "A rare courtesy," he said, "to lock oneself in with strangers. Do be seated." The man hesitated, then did so, perching on the edge of the chair as though he expected it to vanish beneath him. Holmes' gaze travelled over the man in a manner that to others might seem casual, but to me was nothing short of forensic. His eyes paused briefly on the visitor's scuffed boots, the line of dust along his cuffs, and the stiff right cufflink that did not match its partner. "Continental travel," Holmes murmured. "Recently returned, no valet, and some haste in departure. Perhaps a French train schedule to thank for that." The man blinked. "How did you—" "Later," Holmes said. "For now, let us discover what evil has travelled with you across the Channel." "Always waiting upon your arrival." The man swallowed, then spoke. My name is of little consequence for the moment," he began. "But I come to you because something has occurred, Button, something terrible. And I cannot reconcile it with reason." His voice, though low, was tremulous with something deeper than fear. "There was a room," he continued, "a study, my uncle's, locked every night from the inside, a habit of his. He was found dead within it, quite alone, but—" Here his voice faltered, and he leaned forward, eyes wide. "The key, the only key. It was still in my pocket." Silence fell. Even the fire ceased to crackle. "Do you understand, Mr. Holmes? The door was locked, but I never used the key." A chill ran up my spine that the fire could not undo. There was something unnatural in the man's tone, not hysterical, but heavy, as though weighed down by some half-concealed guilt. I turned to Holmes, expecting a sardonic remark or impatient wave of the hand. Instead, I found him alert, still, and curiously sharpened, like a predator that had scented the first drop of blood. "I believe I do understand," he said quietly. "But understanding and proving are different matters entirely." Then, with that particular gleam in his eye I'd come to know well, he added, "Pray, continue." The man shifted in his seat, and with a glance that seemed to weigh both judgment and desperation, he spoke. "My name is Quentin Hartley, of Hartley Hall." At this, Holmes inclined his head very slightly, as though confirming an internal hypothesis. "I suppose the name still carries weight, at least in Dorset," the client muttered, "though I fear soon it may carry scandal instead." He clasped his hands tightly, knuckles blanching. My uncle, Lord Eustace Hartley, is dead. A silence fell at that pronouncement. Heavy, though not entirely unexpected after his earlier hints. He was found alone in his study, Quentin continued, and no one can explain how it occurred, or why I hold the key when I swear I never used it. I watched Holmes' face closely, but he gave no sign of surprise. Continue, he said softly, and do not omit what you fear most to say. It began with a letter, Hartley went on, his voice steadier now that his secret had been loosed. Unexpected. My uncle and I had not spoken in over 5 years, not since a disagreement that I need not burden you with, but the letter was cordial, stiffly so. He invited me to Hartley Hall for a weekend, claiming he was unwell and wished to speak on matters of inheritance and conscience. I arrived the next afternoon. He paused, fingers drumming against his knee. He had not changed much, still proud, still watchful. But there was something else, an edge of suspicion, as though he distrusted the very air he breathed. He refused to discuss his illness, dismissed his valet when I inquired, and locked every door behind him as if expecting an assassin in the wallpaper. He gave a weak laugh. Had he not summoned me himself, I might have thought I was being watched rather than welcomed. That night, said Hartley, we dined together, just the two of us. The food was plain, the conversation strained. He asked questions, some of them curious. Whether I intended to remain in England, whether I still corresponded with certain old friends, whether I believed in redemption. Holmes raised a brow but said nothing. At length, he excused himself and retired to his study. It was his custom to do so and to lock the door from within, a habit born of solitude, he claimed. I went to bed, and when I rose the next morning, the housekeeper, Mrs. Fenley, came to me in a state of panic. He inhaled sharply. She had brought his breakfast but received no answer. We forced the door open. He was slumped in the armchair, quite dead. His face wore no horror, only stillness. There was no sign of violence, no struggle. But the study door had been locked from the inside. And when I reached into my coat later that morning, I found the study key in the inner pocket. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And you swear you did not return it there? Upon my honour, said Hartley. I swear it. At Holmes' bidding, Hartley described the other occupants of the house. There is Mrs. Fenley, the housekeeper, a grim old Puritan, more devoted to scripture than sanity. She has served my uncle since my childhood, and regards all outsiders, myself included, with holy suspicion. Then there is Jules. A manservant? Asked Holmes. Yes. French by birth, hired 3 years ago. Speaks perfect English but keeps to himself. Rather too polite for my liking, always watching, never blinking. He was oddly evasive when asked about my uncle's health. Holmes made a note. And the last? Miss Violet Arkwright, said Hartley after a hesitation. An acquaintance of my uncle's. Supposedly the daughter of a deceased friend, though no one ever saw the man. She's graceful, intelligent, but guarded. She arrived 2 days before me and rarely left the garden. I have no notion why she was there, and my uncle refused to speak of her. A house full of observers, Holmes mused, each watching the others, a crucible of silence. I presume none had access to the study key. Not to my knowledge, said Hartley. The only key was mine. You can understand, said Hartley, why I feared to go to the police. Holmes nodded. A locked room, a dead man, and you holding the only key, not an encouraging arrangement. Exactly, but I never used the key. That's the thing. He locked it himself, always did. I remember distinctly placing the key on the mantel in my room after dinner, and yet, when I reached into my coat later that morning, there it was. He spread his hands. Either I placed it there in some waking dream, or someone else did. You suspect you've been made a scapegoat, Holmes said. I suspect, said Hartley slowly, that someone in that house wanted my uncle dead, all wanted me to believe I was the instrument of it. I glanced at Holmes, expecting him to dismiss the notion as melodrama, but he remained still. "And the room itself?" Holmes asked. "No sign of struggle?" "None. Fire had gone out, curtains drawn, a book in his lap." "And no doctor was summoned?" "Too late for that. The village physician confirmed the death was natural, or at least appeared so." Holmes leaned back. "Nature, it seems, is easily forged." Holmes stood abruptly and paced to the hearth, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Tell me," he said, "why is your left glove slightly damp while the right is dry?" Hartley looked down, puzzled. "I hadn't noticed." Holmes picked it up from the table where the man had laid it. "Moisture consistent with the moss beneath a certain yew hedge, and your boot, the right heel, bears a faint trace of soot and gravel, the type found on the rear path, I would wager. Lastly, your pocket watch is 5 minutes slow, overwound, and smells faintly of candle wax." "What does that signify?" Hartley asked, eyes wide. "That you were not in your bed all night, as you claimed," Holmes said gently. "You rose at approximately 2:10, stepped outside briefly, and knelt by something damp. You may not remember it clearly, or you may remember it too well." Hartley stood, outraged. Peace," Holmes said. "You are no killer, but if someone did plant that key on your person, it was likely during that window of time when your coat was left unattended, which leads us not to motive, but to method." For a time, Holmes said nothing. He lit a fresh pipe, the flare of the match illuminating his sharp profile as though sculpted from the thought itself. Then he spoke. "It is not the death we must understand first, Watson. It is the lock." He turned toward the window, the glass fogged with the winter outside. "A man may be poisoned, frightened, or smothered, but a lock cannot lie. It does what it is told." I watched as his eyes took on that distant gleam I'd seen only when his mind caught scent of something rare. "We must go to Dorset," he said simply, "to Hartley Hall, before the dead are buried too deep and the living speak too freely." Our journey to Dorset was marked by a chilling wind and a sky heavy with rain, a fitting prelude to the sombre estate we were bound to visit. Hartley Hall rose before us, an ancient structure draped in ivy and shadow, its windows dark as if mourning some long-forgotten sorrow. Holmes observed the carriage's approach with a quiet intensity that left me feeling the weight of the investigation to come. Upon our arrival, the heavy wooden door groaned open to reveal a house that seemed to bear the melancholy of its master. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and forgotten secrets. It was clear at once that Hartley Hall had little love for strangers, and even less patience for those who sought answers within its walls. We were received by Mrs. Fenley, the housekeeper, a stern woman whose countenance bespoke years of devout service and whispered disapproval. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and tremulous, as though the very mention of my inquiries disturbed some sacred repose. "Sin reaps its due," she muttered repeatedly, as if that phrase alone explained every mystery that clung to the estate. Yet her hands betrayed her words, trembling slightly as she clutched a worn Bible to her chest. When questioned about the night of Lord Eustace's passing, she offered little beyond vague references to divine judgment and the frailty of man. Holmes listened intently, reading between her pious protests and silence, aware that her devotion concealed as much as it revealed. There was a tension in her presence, as if she guarded not only the household's dignity, but a truth too heavy for mortal lips. In stark contrast to Mrs. Fenley's austerity, Jules, the French valet, greeted us with a polished courtesy that was both impeccable and unsettling. His speech was precise, tinged with the faintest accent, and his eyes held a cool calculation beneath their civility. Holmes' questions soon drew Jules to a small cabinet in his quarters, locked tight and smelling faintly of chemicals. When Holmes pressed for its contents, Jules demurred, offering only that they were personal effects of his own design. His evasiveness, coupled with an almost obsessive interest in the bottle's arrangement, suggested secrets far beyond mere toiletries. Holmes noted every subtle hesitation, the quick glance towards the door, and the slight tightening of the jaw. To me, Jules appeared a man burdened by knowledge he preferred to keep hidden. Holmes's mind was already racing, piecing together the puzzle of this man's reticence and its potential link to the mystery at hand. Miss Violet Arkwright awaited us in the drawing room, a striking figure of grace and reserve. Her poise was that of one accustomed to scrutiny, her eyes sharp and watchful. When Holmes inquired about her relation to Lord Eustace, she responded with measured detachment, denying any familial connection. Yet, I observed a flicker in her gaze at the mere mention of the late Lord's will, as if a shadow passed across her carefully maintained composure. She spoke of her presence at Hartley Hall as that of a friend, a visitor with no claim or expectation. Still, her avoidance of certain topics and the subtle tension in her speech suggested a past intertwined with the family's secrets. Holmes, ever perceptive, took note of her guarded manner, the slight tremor in her hands, and the way she glanced toward a faded portrait that hung nearby. There was more to Violet Arkwright than she chose to reveal. Holmes led me to the study where Lord Eustace had met his end. The room bore no signs of struggle or disorder. Books lay undisturbed upon the shelves, and a fine layer of dust softened the corners. Yet, near the hearth, Holmes paused, drawing my attention to a faint scorch mark upon the hearthstone, barely visible yet unmistakable upon close inspection. He then turned to the doorframe, where near invisible scratches traced a subtle arc along the wood's edge. "Signs," he murmured, "of something mechanical, a lock manipulated with tools rather than keys." The curtains, drawn tightly, blocked out the weak afternoon light, and a faint, peculiar odour lingered in the air, one that I could not identify, but Holmes inhaled deeply. This was no ordinary death scene, nor one left to natural causes. The study, meant to conceal, instead whispered of secrets forcibly kept, and a cunning hand behind the silence. Among the remnants on the hearth, Holmes retrieved a partially burnt corner of a newspaper, its edges curled and blackened by flame. Beside it lay a blotter stained with ink, smeared as if in haste or distress. "A letter," Holmes declared, "was composed here and then deliberately destroyed." He examined the smudges closely, deducing the writer's frustration and urgency. The fragments hinted at a message important enough to be concealed, yet insufficient to reveal its full contents. "Why destroy a letter?" I asked. Holmes shrugged lightly. "Because some truths are dangerous, Watson, and the bearer must weigh the cost of their revelation." This half-consumed note became a vital clue, suggesting hidden motives and undisclosed communications that might unravel the fabric of Hartley's last days. Holmes's attention next turned to the hallway outside the study. Upon the dusty rug, faint impressions caught his eye. An irregular footprint, uneven and shallow, suggesting the presence of a person with a limp. "Observe the pattern," he said. "A gait favouring the left leg, hurried yet cautious, timed to the quarter hour after 2 in the morning." The significance was not lost on me. "A sentinel?" I ventured. Holmes nodded. "Or perhaps a watcher, waiting to act. This figure was close enough to hear, perhaps to intervene." Such evidence spoke to a midnight visitor or conspirator hidden in the stillness of the manor. It was a hint at human activity concealed behind the apparent solitude, a shadow moving quietly beneath the moon's waning light. Finally, Holmes's gaze settled upon a discreet panel beneath the heavy desk. With practiced ease, he discovered a secret drawer, cleverly concealed yet unmistakable once sought. Within lay a sepia-toned photograph. Miss Violet Arkwright, dressed in mourning black, standing beside a weathered gravestone etched in French. The image spoke volumes, silent yet eloquent. "A mourning daughter, or a woman claiming rights long denied," Holmes murmured. Violet's face flickered through my mind, Her guarded demeanour, the subtle signs of grief she tried to mask. This photograph was a key to her true connection to Lord Eustace, a proof of blood and sorrow tangled in the estate's secrets. The drawer, though hidden, had yielded a piece of the puzzle that could not be ignored. Holmes was poring over a small French newspaper, its edges brittle and yellowed when he suddenly sat back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Observe this," he said, pointing to a faded death notice from Verdun. The name caught my eye instantly. Violet Arkwright. The notice spoke of a young woman, recently bereaved, mourning a father lost in distant England. Holmes's voice was quiet but firm. "Miss Arkwright is no mere visitor. She is Lord Eustace's illegitimate daughter, disowned, denied acknowledgement. The obituary, subtle as it is, confirms her claim in the eyes of those who mattered to her father." I saw a flicker of respect in Holmes's eyes, rare and restrained. "The missing letter," Holmes murmured, "was surely intended to restore her name and rights." This revelation cast the entire mystery in a new, more intricate light, and I found myself wondering what shadows lay behind such concealed blood ties. "We must tread carefully," Holmes warned, "for blood, even hidden, commands a story of its own." As Holmes shared this discovery, my thoughts turned to the absent letter, the one Lord Eustace had apparently penned that very night. "Holmes," I said, "could it be that the letter was meant to grant Violet the inheritance she had been denied, and that its disappearance is more than mere coincidence?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Precisely so, Watson. The letter was a bridge, bridging scandal to redemption, silence to confession." I recalled the half-burned blotter and newspaper fragment from the study. They were now fragments of a broken promise. A letter destroyed or concealed would be a dangerous secret indeed. Holmes's eyes gleamed with a scholar's excitement. "It is a cruel irony that the truth which might have saved a family from ruin instead became the cause of its destruction." I thought of Violet, the poised woman who had denied kinship but could scarcely escape the shadow of her birthright. The missing letter was not just paper, it was the fulcrum on which the entire case might turn. Yet it was nowhere to be found. Holmes's suspicions grew more acute as he considered the study door itself. "Watson," he said thoughtfully, "it is entirely possible that the fatal door was never locked from within. A lock, after all, is an instrument of mechanical obedience, not sentience." I looked at him puzzled, but Holmes continued. "There are locks which can be manipulated externally to give the illusion of an internal bolt." His hands moved as if turning an invisible key. "Such a device would explain the impossible, a locked room without an apparent means of entry or exit." His sharp eyes glinted with certainty. "The key found on Mr. Hartley may have been planted to mislead or was never used at all." I wondered how such subtlety could have escaped the initial inquiries. "Our task," Holmes declared, "is to uncover the means by which the lock was deceived, for in that deception lies the murderer's signature." The study door, once a symbol of confinement, now hinted at cunning and craft beyond mere mortal fear. Holmes returned to the study with a keen eye and a delicate instrument from his pocket. "Notice," he said, tracing a slender finger along the inner edge of the lock, "this unusual notch, a groove in the brass scarcely visible unless one knows precisely where to look." He smiled wryly. "This is the mark of a master locksmith or a cunning hand, versed in subterfuge. A tool could be inserted here to engage or disengage the bolt without turning the key." He produced a slender wire, expertly curved. Such a device could lock the door from the outside, rendering the lock's bolt immovable to any who tried to open it later. I marvelled at the ingenuity, but Holmes' expression was sober. The murderer sought to create an impossibility, a locked room murder, to confound the investigation. He paused, then added, "But even the cleverest trick leaves traces. We shall find them, Watson, and bring the truth to light." His gaze swept the room as though it held silent witnesses. waiting for their testimonies to be heard. The lock, once a barrier, was now the gateway to unveiling a calculated deceit. Holmes held up a delicate object, a pocket mirror that had belonged to Miss Violet. On its silvered back, a faint smudge caught the light, almost imperceptible yet pregnant with significance. He examined it with a jeweller's loupe, then lifted his gaze to me. This smudge is not mere dirt or grease. It is a residue of a rare chemical compound, one associated with the production of toxic gases. I recoiled slightly. Holmes was serene as ever. Such compounds, when ignited or burned in a confined space, release vapours capable of inducing cardiac arrest or suffocation, especially in the frail or elderly. I thought of Lord Eustace, solitary in his study, and the quiet manner of his passing. The smudge on the mirror, Holmes concluded, points to Violet's proximity to the means of murder, whether by intent or ignorance, we cannot yet say. But it is the first tangible trace of a method previously obscured by the absence of violence. His eyes narrowed. We are now dealing not with a sudden death, but a carefully engineered silence. Holmes's voice lowered to a whisper as he outlined his grim hypothesis. Picture, if you will, the study late that night. Lord Eustace reclining in his chair, wearied by age and burdened by secrets. Nearby, a chemical compound, such as that traced to the mirror, is slowly burned in the fireplace, invisible to the untrained eye. He paused, inhaling deeply as though to summon the scent from memory. This would release a poisonous gas, odourless and colourless, which would quickly suffocate or stop the heart of the unsuspecting victim. I shuddered at the quiet cruelty of it all. The lack of any disturbance, no cry or sign of struggle, fits precisely with this theory. Holmes turned to me, his eyes gleaming with cold certainty. A death designed to appear natural, to lull the household into false security. But it required careful timing and knowledge of the victim's habits. And the locked door? I asked, breathless. A staged impossibility to confound the authorities. Holmes gave a faint, grim smile. Indeed, Watson, a murder without fire and death without a trace. As the pieces fell into place, Holmes's usually unyielding certainty showed signs of hesitation. The evidence suggests a partnership between Violet and Jules, he remarked. Yet I find myself wondering if one is a willing conspirator or merely a pawn in a crueler game. I glanced at Holmes, surprised by the doubt in his tone. How so? I ventured. Consider Violet's guarded demeanour, the photograph in mourning, and her denial of kinship. She carries the weight of secrets, but not necessarily guilt. Holmes paused, fingers steepled again. Jules, the man with chemical knowledge and a penchant for secrecy, presents a more obvious suspect, yet human nature is seldom so simple. He gave a sardonic chuckle. One might say the Gerd doctor is too sentimental, but in this matter, it may be prudent to suspect that the victim's daughter was herself victimized, her innocence manipulated by a darker will. Holmes's gaze grew distant. It is this tangled web of silence and deception that we must unravel, lest we condemn the wrong soul to infamy. Holmes's eyes gleamed with a familiar spark as he revealed his plan. To flush out the truth, Watson, we must resort to theatricality. He instructed me to prepare a fabricated letter purportedly discovered hidden among the ashes, one that would implicate Lord Eustace in matters of guilt and confession, naming Violet as rightful heir, but also hinting at betrayal. At dinner tomorrow, he explained, you will read this letter aloud. Watch the faces it elicits. Fear, surprise, guilt. The culprit cannot withstand such provocation. I felt a surge of nervous anticipation, but trusted Holmes implicitly. This ruse, he added, will illuminate the shadows where truth now hides. When lies are confronted by the spectre of revelation, they tend to unravel. Holmes paused, his expression unreadable. The dinner table will become our stage, and the players shall reveal themselves. I could not help but admire the drama with which my friend approached the case, even as a cold shiver ran down my spine. The trap was set. Only the cunning and the guilty would spring it. That evening, the dinner table was set with an air of quiet dignity, its polished surface reflecting the flickering candlelight, though none of the assembled guests seemed aware they were to partake in a performance far removed from mere hospitality. Holmes moved with deliberate precision, placing each course and glass as though composing a subtle symphony rather than a meal. The usual clatter and hum of conversation were absent. A heavy silence hung over Hartley Hall, broken only by the soft rustling of fabric and occasional clearing of a throat. I observed our client, Quentin, seated stiffly, and across from him, Miss Violet Arkwright, who appeared composed, yet guarded. Jules, the ever-watchful valet, maintained his customary polite demeanour, though I sensed a flicker of unease beneath. Holmes himself was inscrutable, his eyes glinting with the cold fire of one preparing a trap. The servants moved quietly, shadows within shadows, as though the house itself awaited the unravelling of its dark secret. I found myself wondering how long such fragile peace might endure once the first words were spoken, and whether the players would rise to meet the challenge or crumble beneath the weight of revelation. When the moment arrived, Holmes nodded to me with a subtle smile, and I cleared my throat to break the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "we have been fortunate to recover a most extraordinary document from the ashes of the late Lord Eustace's study." From my pocket, I produced the carefully crafted letter, its aged paper and ink convincingly forged. As I read aloud, the room fell utterly still. The letter spoke of confession and regret, of a lifetime's mistakes, and of a final wish to restore Violet Arkwright as rightful heir, while issuing a thinly veiled warning against Quentin Hartley. The weight of the words hung heavily. I caught the subtle exchange of glances, the quickening breath of those present. Jules's hand trembled, causing his fork to clatter against the plate with an unnatural loudness. Violet paled noticeably and abruptly sank into her chair, fainting from the shock. The letter's contents had done precisely what Holmes intended, unsettled the equilibrium and pried open the sealed chamber of secrets. The room's atmosphere shifted palpably from tense curiosity to profound anxiety, and for a moment, even Holmes's measured countenance betrayed a flicker of triumph. The sudden collapse of Miss Violet sent a ripple through the assembled guests, breaking the fragile spell I had wrought. Jules leaned forward, a mask of concern slipping to reveal something darker, perhaps fear or guilt. The room was charged with an electric tension, as if the very walls bore witness to the unravelling of hidden truths. Silence reigned but for the faint, rapid breaths of the fainted woman and the ticking of a distant clock. Holmes rose slowly, his gaze piercing each face in turn, noting the smallest signs of discomfort or deception. The clatter of dropped cutlery punctuated the stillness, a subtle symphony of revelation. I could see the muscles in Jules's jaw twitch, while Quentin's eyes darted anxiously, searching for reassurance. Holmes's voice cut through the heavy air with surgical precision. "The letter you have heard is but a shadow, a phantom designed to expose those who would conceal the truth." He allowed the moment to linger before continuing. "Now, we shall illuminate what lies beneath these shadows and see who is truly the architect of death at Hartley Hall." The guests shifted uneasily, each now acutely aware that the evening's quiet dignity was the final veil before the storm. Holmes moved with the calm confidence of a maestro revealing the final movement of a complex symphony. From a leather case upon the sideboard, he produced a crisp, authentic letter, its ink dry but resolute, a stark contrast to the earlier forgery. "This," he declared, "is the genuine letter of Lord Eustace, confirming no accusation, but a heartfelt reconciliation with his daughter." Next, Holmes revealed a slender, expertly crafted tool, a lockpick fashioned with unusual precision. "This instrument," he explained, "was employed to simulate the locking of the study door from within, deceiving all who examined it." Lastly, he displayed a small vial, its contents a faintly shimmering liquid. "And here lies the poison, administered not through violence, but stealth." He detailed how Jules, versed in chemistry, had concocted the substance and used it to induce a silent, natural-seeming death. Holmes's narrative wove the elements together, explaining the calculated sequence, the letter's disappearance, the locked door illusion, the toxin's silent work. Each revelation was met with a mixture of astonishment and dread by those present. Holmes's sharp intellect and his unwavering poise turned the impossible into the inevitable, laying bare the cold logic beneath the tragedy. The murder was no accident, he concluded, but a deliberate orchestration of fear and misdirection. The truth settled over the room like a dense fog as Holmes recounted the final moments of Lord Eustace's life. He was not frightened to death, as some might suppose, Holmes asserted. Instead, he was poisoned in his evening tea, a toxin invisible and swift, administered with the cold precision of a skilled hand. He described how the old lord, accustomed to solitude, locked himself away, unaware that his death had been meticulously arranged. The lock was set to deceive, the letter was taken to conceal, and the poison worked silently, leaving no mark but final stillness. Holmes's voice held no triumph, only the solemnity of a man revealing a grim design. As the conclusion settled, I glanced toward Violet, whose expression was one of anguish mixed with disbelief. Holmes then revealed the final piece. Jules, once her lover and now avenger, enacted this cruel play to punish both father and daughter in twisted justice. The room remained silent, the weight of betrayal and sorrow heavy upon us all. In that silence, I realized the depth of human frailty, that vengeance often harms the innocent far more than the guilty. Holmes's voice softened, though it carried an unmistakable edge of cold judgment. The tragedy here is twofold. Miss Violet Arkwright, despite her poised exterior, is a woman crushed beneath the weight of secrets not entirely her own. He paused, eyes narrowing. She is no murderer, but a victim of circumstance, caught in the tangled web spun by one who once called himself her lover. I noticed the flicker of disgust that passed over Holmes's face as he continued. Jules, the French valet, was more than a servant. Once a chemist, his bitterness towards Lord Eustace for abandoning Violet festers like an open wound. His knowledge of poisons and subtle mechanics gave him the means to enact a revenge both cruel and calculated. Holmes's fingers tapped rhythmically on the table. A man scorned, wielding his expertise to punish not only the man who wronged him, but the daughter he once professed to love. A dark irony indeed. There was a moment's silence as the guests digested the weight of Holmes's words. Behind the curtain of respectability, Holmes concluded, lie the restless ghosts of love betrayed and vengeance misdirected. Holmes drew from his pocket a slender, glinting instrument and placed it carefully on the table. Observe this, Watson. A lockpick fashioned with exquisite precision, capable of manipulating the bolt from outside the door, rendering the locked room nothing more than a stage trick. He demonstrated with deft fingers how such a tool could slide into the groove he had earlier identified, engaging the mechanism without the need for a key. This device, Holmes explained, was used by Jules to give the illusion that the study door was locked from within, a detail crucial to the deception. He then turned to Quentin's coat, producing it with deliberate flourish. And here, he continued, is the planted key. While Mr. Hartley's vigil was brief and genuine, his coat was left unattended long enough for the key to be slipped inside by a careful hand. I could scarcely contain my astonishment at the ingenuity of such a plan. Holmes looked up, his voice sharp. It was this careful orchestration of lock and key that sought to bind suspicion tightly around the wrong man. The complexity of the scheme was clear, but Holmes's calm mastery over it was even clearer. Suddenly, as if sensing the noose tightening, Jules made a desperate dash from the table, startling everyone into silence. With surprising agility for a man of his years, he surged towards the door, eyes wild with panic. But outside, awaiting in shadow, stood constables whom Holmes had discreetly summoned earlier that day. Their presence was invisible to all but Holmes and me. As Jules grasped the handle, strong hands seized him firmly, halting his flight as though by an unseen force. "You are my prisoner," Holmes declared with unshaken authority. Jules struggled, but was quickly subdued. The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. Even Violet, pale and shaken, watched the scene unfold with tear-filled eyes. "Justice," Holmes remarked quietly, "often comes not as a thunderclap, but as the gentle closing of a door, quiet, inevitable, and inescapable." It was a lesson both Jules and all present would soon understand. The guilty, it seemed, cannot outrun the patient pursuit of truth. As the final pieces fell into place, Violet's composed facade crumbled utterly. She sank to her knees, sobs racking her slender frame, as she cursed the cruel fates that had shaped her life. "My father," she cried, voice trembling with anguish, "chose to cast me into shadow, denying me even the right to my own name. And yet, it was he who died alone, betrayed by those he trusted." Her words, raw and honest, filled the room with a profound sorrow. Turning her gaze to Jules, she whispered with bitter venom, "And you, once my protector, now my executioner in disguise." Holmes watched silently, his expression unreadable, but his eyes reflecting a rare empathy. "Vengeance, when wielded blindly," he mused softly, "destroys not only the target, but the hand that strikes." Violet's tears ceased, replaced by a haunting resolve. "I forgive, but I will never forget," she said. The tragedy of Hartlepool Hall lay not only in death but in the fractures of family and trust. It was a reminder, painfully clear, that justice is often a fragile thing, balanced precariously on the edge of human frailty. Upon our return to Baker Street, the familiar scent of tobacco and leather welcomed us as a sharp contrast to the chill that still clung to my bones from Dorset's foggy moors. Holmes settled into his accustomed armchair, his eyes distant yet attentive, the fire casting flickering shadows across his resolute features. The conversation took a colder tone, weighted with the gravity of the revelations to come. Holmes, ever the master of methodical deduction, began to unravel the threads of the case with deliberate care. His voice was steady but tinged with a rare solemnity as he spoke of deception, betrayal, and the fragile nature of truth. I listened, captivated, as the fog outside thickened and curled like the mysteries we had just left behind. Holmes paused now and then, as if weighing each piece of evidence against the delicate balance of justice. It was not merely a case to solve, but a tragedy to comprehend, a sombre reminder of the shadows that dwell in human hearts, and the truths that even the keenest mind must approach with reverence. Holmes's sharp eyes gleamed as he led me through the intricate sequence of events revealed by the smallest details. "Consider the limp," he began, evidenced by the uneven impression in the hallway rug, betraying a figure who moved cautiously yet deliberately at precisely 2:15 in the morning. He illustrated how such a subtle mark spoke volumes about the movements of those within the household. Turning to the study, Holmes pointed to the faint scorch near the fireplace. This was no ordinary hearth fire, but the cradle of a silent killer's weapon, a chemical compound releasing a fatal gas unnoticed. His fingers traced the lock's peculiar notch with practiced ease. A masterfully crafted groove allowed the bolt to be manipulated from outside, fooling every observer into believing the door was secured from within. Holmes smiled thinly. It was a ruse, an illusion designed to confound and mislead. I marvelled at how these small clues, unnoticed by others, had coalesced into an undeniable narrative. Holmes's mind, ever agile, connected each element like a virtuoso weaving a complex tapestry of human folly and calculated cruelty, transforming chaos into clarity. Holmes held the delicate pocket mirror with reverence, explaining how its subtle chemical residue became a key piece in the puzzle. A cosmetic item easily overlooked, yet here it holds the trace of a rare poison, an agent known for its silent, deadly efficacy. He detailed the properties of the compound, colourless, odourless, and swift in its fatal effect, perfect for a murder staged to appear natural. The smudge upon the mirror's back, discovered in Violet's quarters, linked her to the method of murder, though not necessarily to its intent. Holmes's eyes, normally cold and analytic, briefly softened as he considered this. It reveals the care and cunning employed in the crime, but also the complexity of those involved. I was struck by how even the smallest, most personal object could betray such profound secrets. Holmes's subtle poetry and deduction elevated the mundane into the extraordinary, reminding me why I so admired his intellect. The mirror, a simple tool of vanity, had become a silent witness to a father's death and the tragic ripples that followed. Holmes's discourse turned toward the motive, peeling back the layers of human emotion entwined in the crime. This was not a case of simple greed or inheritance, he declared. Instead, it is a tale of twisted justice wrought by pride and wounded affection. He recounted Jules's transformation from a man of science and affection for Violet to a vengeful figure driven by bitterness against Lord Eustace. His obsession with retribution blinded him to the cost of his actions. Holmes's tone was stern, tempered with an almost poetic sadness. Revenge, when fueled by love turned sour, becomes a peril not only to the intended victim, but to all who dwell in its shadow. The case illustrated, Holmes said, the dangerous alchemy of passion and intellect divorced from morality. The poison was a cruel instrument, but the true poison was the bitterness that festered long before the final act. I realized then that beneath the cleverness of the plot lay the tragic folly of human frailty, a lesson Holmes seemed reluctant yet compelled to impart with his usual unyielding clarity. Holmes held in his hand the slender, gleaming tool that had so confounded all previous investigators. "This," he said quietly, "is the key to the impossible." With expert fingers, he demonstrated how the device slid seamlessly into the study door's lock, engaging a hidden notch that mimicked the action of the internal bolt. A masterstroke of mechanical deceit, he declared. The door, apparently locked from within, was in truth manipulated from without. Such a ruse requires not only precision, but a deep understanding of locks, knowledge that Jewel possessed and wielded with cruel intent. Holmes's gaze met mine, sharp and unyielding. We see now that the locked room was no barrier but a stage prop, designed to mislead and create the illusion of an unsolvable mystery. The trick lay not in the impossible, but in the artful illusion of security, a trap to ensnare suspicion and divert attention from the true culprit. As I pondered the cunning involved, I felt again that familiar mixture of awe and unease at Holmes's ability to pierce through even the most elaborate veils of deception. In the days following the revelation, Violet Arkwright vanished from London without a trace or farewell. Holmes shared this news with a rare note of solemnity. She departed quietly, unburdened by accusation but weighed down by grief. I recalled the woman's composed demeanour at Hartley Hall, which masked a tempest of sorrow and restraint. Holmes mused that though her name was cleared of direct involvement, the shadows of her birthright and the secrets of her family would follow her still. Violet is, in many ways, the quietest victim of all, Holmes said thoughtfully, denied acknowledgement in life, forced into silence by circumstance, and left with a future uncertain and solitary. I could not help but feel a pang of sympathy. Holmes, for all his brilliance, understood the poignancy of human frailty and the costs exacted by secrets kept too long. Violet's departure was not merely a retreat, but an escape from the cruel entanglements of blood and betrayal. In her absence, the estate and those left behind would forever carry the echo of her silent suffering. Holmes settled back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the flickering fire, as if seeking answers within its shifting flames. Justice, he began, his voice low and reflective, is rarely a clear and shining path. More often, it is a winding road beset with shadows, where truth and error intertwine. I listened as he spoke of the dangers inherent when emotion clouds reason, and when the quest for vengeance obscures the finer distinctions between guilt and innocence. In this case, Holmes continued, we see a tableau of misdirected passions, love, pride, and bitterness that led to ruin not just for the guilty, but for those caught in their wake. He regarded me thoughtfully. Miss Violet, the quietest victim, acted with truth and restraint, yet bore the greatest burden. Perhaps it is a reminder that truth, once entangled with human frailty, can wound deeper than any lie. I was struck by the melancholy wisdom in his words, knowing that beneath Holmes's sharp intellect lay a profound understanding of the human condition. As the firelight danced, I sensed that the case had left its mark not only upon the Hartley family, but upon us all. Winter had settled upon London with a cold hush, the city's streets muffled beneath a fresh layer of snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds under the gaslight. Within our modest rooms at 221B Baker Street, the warmth of the fire was a sharp contrast to the chill outside. Yet even that comfort could not wholly dispel the sombre thoughts that lingered in the air. The case of Hartley Hall, with its tangled secrets and shattered lives, felt like a heavy cloak draped over my mind. Holmes sat silent, his gaze distant, as though the frost outside had found a mirror within his own heart. The finality of the mystery weighed on us both, the justice served, yet at a cost neither fully embraced. In that quiet moment, I realized that some investigations do not merely conclude, they settle into the soul, as unyielding and fragile as the winter's frost. Holmes, seated by the hearth, produced his violin and drew the bow across its strings, filling the room with a sombre, wandering melody. The tune was without words, but spoke volumes. A lament for the lost, a reflection of the shadows still cast by the case. I watched as his fingers danced over the strings with effortless precision, his usually sharp features softened by the music's melancholy. The notes echoed the unspoken sorrows, the hidden grief of Violet Arkwright, and the quiet despair of a family torn asunder by secrets and vengeance. It was a rare glimpse of Holmes's soul, a fleeting admission that beneath his icy intellect lay a man capable of profound feeling. The music wove itself into the stillness, a haunting reminder that not all truths find resolution, and not every wound finds balm. As the last note faded, I found myself breaking the silence, compelled by thoughts that had long stirred in my mind. "Holmes," I ventured gently, "do you ever wonder if Violet Arkwright might have been an ally rather than a victim? Had her father chosen honesty over shame? Had her story been met with compassion instead of denial?" Holmes regarded me with his keen, inscrutable eyes. "A fair question, Watson," he replied slowly. "In another world, perhaps, her intelligence and resolve could have been formidable assets rather than burdens." He paused, as if weighing his words. "But the truths we uncover are often entangled with human frailty, pride, fear, and the cruelty of circumstance." I nodded, sensing the unspoken wisdom beneath his reply. "Sometimes," Holmes added with quiet finality, "the greatest tragedies arise not from the deeds themselves, but from the secrets left to fester in darkness." It was a poignant reflection on justice, mercy, and the shadows that linger where light cannot reach. Holmes's gaze turned toward the window, where the snow fell in silent, unyielding sheets. "Some doors, once locked, should never be opened, Watson," he said, with the measured finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. His voice carried the weight of experience and resignation. "There are truths too painful, histories too tangled, and wounds too deep for the comfort of daylight." He looked back at me, eyes sharp yet distant. "Our task is to seek justice, Yes, but also to recognize the cost that truth can exact. It was a verdict not only on the case, but on the human heart itself, a reminder that some mysteries are best left to rest behind their own sealed doors. With that, Holmes rose quietly, turned the key in our own door, and retreated into his chamber, leaving the ghosts of Hartley Hall to their silence. I sat by the fire, pondering the weight of what had passed, aware that some echoes linger long after the last step fades beneath the gaslight's flicker. Holmes settled back in his chair, eyes gleaming with that familiar spark of intellect. Watson, this case reminds us that truth is often a double-edged sword. While it reveals, it can also wound deeply, sometimes more than any lie ever could. The locked door was not just a barrier to justice, but a symbol of the secrets we choose to keep hidden, for better or worse. He paused, then added with his usual quiet sharpness. One wonders, though, was it the clever trickery or the failure to see past pride that proved the criminal's undoing? What do you think was the pivotal mistake that led to the murderer's capture? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery with us, please subscribe for more tales of deduction. And don't forget to share this story with fellow lovers of Sherlock Holmes. Your next adventure awaits.